Now, there are two more slides in this first part of the class that don't necessarily relate to grades, but they are things that I want you to kind of keep in mind throughout the semester, so I thought I'd include them at the end here. The first big thing I want to talk about is something that actually was brought to my attention the very first semester I taught this course. It was when I had a student come to me midway through the semester, kind of struggling and asking, why do we even offer this course? That's what she asked me. And at the time, I all I could tell her was, maybe you're going to get into a field like nursing or teaching where you got to know this stuff. But looking back at that, what I've realized now is that there's actually a lot of different reasons why people should take this course. One of the big reasons why everybody should take this course is because it's completely related to every aspect of your life. Even when you look at your family, when you look at your friends, we kind of think of everybody as very set. Nothing's really changing with them. But even in those situations where you see people over and over again, you see moments where these people are constantly changing, where there's alterations happening. And once you've taken a class like this, you can really appreciate that unfolding process that's going on in front of your eyes that we oftentimes miss. And more importantly, you can also appreciate the unfolding process that's happening within you. Many of us in our early adult years think of ourselves as set, but when we see this idea of developmental psychology kind of unfolding, when we look at all the different processes that are going on and we take a step back from ourselves, we can really appreciate how unbelievably applicable this topic is, even if we don't find a career in it. But another reason why this is so important, and this is something that I can't stress enough, is that almost every position, every area of your life requires that you know this information. If you plan on being a parent, if you plan on getting into any career that involves people of different age groups, knowing how the developmental process works physiologically, cognitively, socially, can all really impact, or actually can really help you perform better in those careers or those moments of your life. So not only is this interesting stuff, not only is this worth knowing, but there's a lot of application to the material that we're covering. And I want you to keep that in mind when you're slogging through week 6 or 7 and really struggling to stay awake. Know that there's a lot of application, there's a lot of things that you can use from this class. It might not necessarily be the case for some of the other courses that you could take along your educational career. Another thing that I've been asked over the years, and something I think is really important, is how to do well in this class. It seems tough. There's a lot of different things that you have to do. There's a lot of work that you have to do in a very condensed period of time, and students tend to think that it's a bit overwhelming at times. And I agree. If you don't do things correctly, this can be a very daunting class. But there are a couple of ways that you can really help your chances of doing well in this class. First thing I would strongly suggest, as I mentioned earlier, is that you bookmark this website on your internet browser so you are constantly accessing the course website. The syllabus is also available, and I want you to kind of memorize that so you know exactly when everything's happening. Know when the exams are, know when the posts are due, know every detail about what's expected of you. Because if you've got those things in your mind, you can be significantly more prepared as things come up along the way. Another thing I can't stress enough is that even though I have no way of looking over your shoulder to verify that you've done the readings, if you do the readings, it will show. Your comprehension of the material will be much better. Your success on the exams will be very evident. And again, even though it's easy to fall away, if you're looking to thrive in this class, that is one of the best things I would suggest doing. The other thing I would suggest doing, if you really want to do well, is find a way to play this presentation from beginning to end every single time. Right now in this first class, I'm guessing most of you have made it through the 20 minutes without really a huge lapse in attention. But when we get on to the 6th or 7th or 8th or 9th presentation, it can start to become a little tiresome. You've heard my voice for way too long by then. Things have started to become less exciting and more just, homework and responsibility. And because of that, I know people are tempted to just kind of find a way to cheat and get the full credit for the post without actually having to listen to the presentation, without actually having to read the book. And when you do that, you could theoretically slide by. Some students can't slide by, others can, but in the long run, it does tend to cost everybody. It tends to hurt them not only in an occasional point that they lose in the post, but also in the exams. And when you look back at what you learned from this class, skipping the presentation, skipping the readings, means you have a huge void in what you should have learned from this particular class. So even though I know there's a temptation to skip some of the videos, skip some of the activities that we're going to be doing along the way, or just kind of coast by the slides that you think are going to be really important, or are not going to be really important, sorry. If you can do your best to listen to me throughout the entire presentation, it's really going to benefit you. Of course, if you do find yourself starting to lose attention, I do have a great suggestion, and that's just to stop the slides. And unfortunately, this version of PowerPoint doesn't allow me to kind of let you just access the slides anywhere within it, so you'd have to start from the beginning of whatever slide you stop. But you can start in the middle of the presentation on whatever slides you want. So if you get overwhelmed, if you get tired or fatigued, just stop the slide after you've listened to one, and then come back when you're prepared. And that's actually something that makes this class a little bit easier than some of the in-person classes for some students, is because you have that ability to stop whenever you want. You should be able to be completely attentive when you're listening to the presentation and slides. And that's something that's kind of unique to this class, even though the temptation to not listen is also really, really strong for an online class like this. So if you can avoid it, I promise you will do significantly better in this class. All right, now that we've covered the general idea of what we're going to be kind of doing for this class, we've covered the grade stipulations, everything that you need to do. What we're going to be doing in the second half of today's introduction is be talking about what this class is all about. And to do that, what I've done is broken up this last topic into 3 different parts. We're going to start by talking about what people in developmental psychology actually believe, essentially the theory behind what developmental psychology is all about. And then after that, we're going to be talking about specific areas that we're going to be getting into throughout the semester, big chunks of groupings that people within the field of developmental psychology study. And lastly, we're going to be talking about some of the tools that are used by developmental psychologists in order to explore the areas that they're interested in. You're going to need to know about all of these pieces of information throughout the entire class. So even though we're going to be pretty broad here in today's topic, we will get into specifically, much more detail as we progress throughout the entire semester. To understand the general goal of what developmental psychologists try to achieve, what I thought we'd do today is a little activity. And this one requires you to actually probably pause the slides after I've introduced it so you can think about something that we often don't think about. What I'd like you to do is think about 6 things from your life that you think were very, very impactful on you. So it could have been an early childhood experience. It could have been something that happened last week. Whatever they are, I want you to think of those moments, and I want you to try to kind of imagine the details of it, the age that you were when you were experiencing it, and also try to figure out why you think that particular moment is so monumental. If you could pause the slides after this little bit here and really do that and then progress to the next slide, we can discuss why that activity really highlights what developmental psychology is really all about in its essence. All right. Hopefully most of you did pause the slides and actually thought about these events. And what I wanted to show you from these events is that even though all of those events that you listed are probably completely unique from most of your classmates, there does usually seem to be a large amount of overlap as to when some of these life-changing events happen. So some of you probably listed things like your first kiss, or the first time you embarrassed yourself in front of your friends, or some death of a family member that happened at a specific age. And even though these things are definitely unique to you, What many developmental psychologists assume when studying the lifespan is that there's differences, but a lot of similarities within these differences. In essence, they say that even though your life is its own script, each script has a resemblance to a lot of the scripts of peoples around you. And this idea can best be reflected in an analogy that many people give to the concept of lifespan development. And it's a notion that everybody is kind of like a snowflake. Right? For those of you that have studied snowflake, I know since most of us are in California, we don't see them very often, but if you've ever seen a snowflake, there's this idea that no two snowflakes are completely alike. Now, I don't know if we have any way to actually test or verify that information, but that's the assumption that people have, is every snowflake is completely unique. And that's what a lot of developmental psychologists believe about people. That there's no overlap from person to person that's absolutely perfect. But at the same time, what developmental psychologists argue is that our unfolding process, our growth, just like the development of a snowflake, has some trends to it. And if you look at one person's process of growth, the changes that they underwent, you might oftentimes see some very, very stark similarities between that person and somebody else. And more importantly, when we see a specific event, maybe a change in temperature or a change in altitude for a snowflake causing one snowflake to adjust, usually snowflakes that experience similar events have the same changes, and we assume the same thing for human beings. If something happens to you at a young age, maybe biologically or socially or cognitively, those changes can push you in a specific direction the exact same way it can push somebody else in the exact same direction. And that's really the goal of developmental psychology, to study this unfolding process, to look at the events that can push you, to look at the normal changes that somebody undergoes, and to really describe how these events can shape who you are in a predictable pattern, knowing that everybody is unique, knowing that there's always going to be individual differences, but still trying to get a sense of continuity, a sense of order to all of the different things that happen to each of us within our lifespan. Now, when we look at this process of change, when we look for those similarities, when we look for this unfolding that a person goes through in their life, lifespan developmental psychologists undergo a lot of assumptions or use a lot of assumptions in order to really explore the field in the way that we just discussed. One of the things that they assume, one of the big things that kind of makes it lifespan development, is that when we look at a person's changing, it's not something that just happens when they become an adult. It's not something that happens, in our first infantile years when we're just starting to develop skills. It's something that theoretically happens throughout our entire life. The idea is that we're constantly ebbing and flowing, moving, changing, and that's why some people even have proposed that we don't even call this class lifespan development. We call this lifespan change, because development kind of gives the implication that we're always growing. But instead, many people think we should assume that we're just altering. We're kind of altering who we are, how we see the world, how we interact with the world. And when we get into the field of lifespan development, we're really looking at all the changes that happen from the moment of conception all the way to the last days of our life. And there's the assumption, the idea, that there is constant change going on. And when we look at this change, another assumption is the fact that it does happen in a number of different facets. Right? We're not just physically changing, we're not just mentally changing, we're not just socially changing. All three of these things are kind of playing a role in our unfolding person that we are and who we become throughout our life. And we're going to really detail those different facets as we progress in today's class, so you can get a better sense of all the things that developmental psychologists do study in this particular field. And then the last thing, as we kind of hinted at before, that these people assume when studying lifespan development, is that it is multidirectional. That means you're not just growing, you're also sometimes declining in different skills. Things are changing, and those declines, those alterations in who we are just as intriguing to developmental psychologists as the growth. So we're going to be, again, throughout this class, looking at the entire lifespan, conception to death, and that allows us to look at not only the growth, the change in the younger years, but also the flows, the kind of declines that happen usually in most of our later years. Now, when we look at this idea of development, though, there is one thing that you want to bear in mind throughout the entire semester. It's a big idea. It's this idea that when we study development, when we talk about changes that are happening, a lot of the changes we're going to be discussing are very what we call contextual. What that means is that when we say these changes happen and they cause you to become this type of person, these changes are not necessarily universal for everybody across every group of individuals. When we talk about age, we can see how with one age, a specific change can cause a person to move in one direction, while at a later age, if they experience that exact same thing, it could actually impact them in a completely different way. So when we talk about things like puberty or other changes as we progress throughout the class, you're going to see that the age a person is has a huge impact on how the social influences or the environmental influences cause a person to develop in a specific way. Another thing that we see is that the history, the era that somebody's coming from, can have a huge impact on how they're changing, how they're developing. There are many, many different studies that have shown that each generation responds to different things in different ways, and the unfolding process happens differently from group to group. And that also relates to another idea that we've also discovered that we've seen differences from culture to culture. Some cultures develop faster than others in specific facets, while they at the same time develop slower than others in other facets of growth. And all of this is something that we're just starting to scratch the surface of, to understand how all of these things play a role. And the last thing that's really important when we talk about development is that everything is usually dependent upon the person. So if you've had a traumatic experience, if you've had something going on, then that unfolding process, the events that can push one person in one direction might not work for another individual who's had something happen to them. So even though we talk about development as this kind of universal thing, we talk about all of these rules, remember, you have to take into account the history of the person, the life events that they've gone through, the age of the individual, the culture that they're growing up in. All of these things have to be taken into account if we're going to predict with any certainty how a person is going to develop throughout their entire lifespan.